What's up, YouTube? Before I get into the video, let me remind you, if you like my content, please hit that like and subscribe button. And if you feel the need to support me, hit me up on my Patreon at patreon.com/uncommonramen, capital U, capital R. I do all of this in my free time, so any amount of support can help me bring more of the content to you more often. Okay, so today we are going to be taking a look at a mono black commander deck that I just recently built with Syr Konrad at the helm. This is actually a budget deck, despite the fact that this is Syr Konrad, because this isn't your typical Syr Konrad deck. A lot of people, when they build Syr Konrad, it's built for a full party mill. So everybody mills, including yourself. And so a lot of those Syr Konrad decks rely on their opponents to have creatures in their decks as well as themselves. The Syr Konrad deck that I have built today is simply built on getting as many triggers of his ability as possible, and it is a self-mill deck. So we are going to cut out the need for the other players and just use self-mill to help us achieve our victory. With that, we're going to have synergies with putting cards into our graveyard, as well as having them exit our graveyard, since Syr Konrad will see creatures both entering the graveyard and exiting the graveyard from various points. So we're going to take advantage a lot of that ability to try and shut out a game. And like I said, it is a budget deck. I just recently added one of the new Lord of the Rings cards in there that brought it above $80. Originally, you could probably buy this deck in all the printings that you see here today for about $80. But I added the Palantir of Orthanc, I think it's called. And that brought the price up to about $86. So you still can get away with getting this deck in its current version for under 100, or actually even under 90. So let's talk about Syr Konrad really quick. Very simple card, uncommon, 3 and 2 black for a 5/4 body. And basically whenever a creature dies, another creature. So Syr Konrad does not see himself, but whenever another creature dies, or a creature is put into a graveyard from anywhere other than the battlefield, or a creature card leaves your graveyard, Syr Konrad the Grim does 1 damage to each opponent. And then Syr Konrad has his own built-in ability to help mill, which is 1 and a black. Each player puts the top card of their library into their graveyard to help mill cards incidentally if you have the mana left over. Obviously, we're going to try and build the deck so that we don't have to do that, but we have the added bonus of doing that. Because this is self-mill, that means that we're going to focus on a lot of creatures. There is going to be a very large portion of creatures as opposed to most other cards in here. If I remember correctly, there was 38 creatures. Let me just double check that. No, there's 35 creatures. 35 creatures. All right, so we're going to start off with an Angel of Suffering. This guy is 3 and 2 black for a 5/3 with flying. And basically, if damage would be dealt to you, you prevent that damage and mill twice that many cards. Again, we're trying to achieve the idea of getting as many triggers on Syr Konrad as possible, and milling creatures into the graveyard will trigger him. This card can get dangerous, though, so you have to be careful with it. You have lots of sack outlets to help you get rid of this, should it become a huge problem. But early game, this card is a workhorse. Next up, we have Blood Artist. For 1 and a black, you have a 0/1 body. Whenever Blood Artist or another creature dies, target player loses 1 life and you gain a life. I like this one for a couple of reasons. Unfortunately, it only hits target player, but it also allows you to gain the life that your opponent, that whatever player you targeted, loses. And it sees creatures dying. So again, we're going to see Konrad see that trigger as well, and it's going to be 2 damage and 1 life for you. Next, we have Crow of Dark Tidings. This is 2 and a black for a 2/1 with flying. When it enters the battlefield or dies, put the top 2 cards of your library into your graveyard. Again, just getting that self-mill trigger. It's a 2/1 body with flying. I assume at some point in time your opponent's going to try and kill it. So you'll if they don't, you have sack triggers. There's a lot of really fun reanimation in this as well. Next up, we have Demon's Disciple. This is a sack trigger in a sense. For 2 and a black, you have a 3/1. When it enters the battlefield, each player sacrifices a creature or planeswalker. We're going to see a bunch of these types of cards in here. Not every single one that's printed, but pretty close to every single one that's printed. And this will help just on this body alone. If all of your opponents have a creature in play, you're going to see 4 triggers from Syr Konrad. And I think that's pretty amazing, especially for 3. Next up, we have Doom Whisperer. This is 3 and 2 black for a 6/6 with flying and trample, and it has pay 2 life to surveil for 2. So Surveil lets you look at the top 2 cards of your library, or in this case, Surveil 2 lets you look at the top 2 cards of your library, and then you can choose to put any of those cards in your graveyard, which is exactly what we want to do with Syr Konrad, because we can look at the top 2 and literally just discard any creatures and get just free triggers off of Syr Konrad, and all you have to do is pay 2 life. And you can do that because this doesn't have to tap to use that ability. You can do that the minute it enters the battlefield, and you can do it as often as you'd like. So if you want to, for whatever reason, put yourself down by 20 life, you can Surveil quite a few times, 10 times. Next up, we have Dreadhound. Dreadhound is 4 and 2 black for a 6/6. When it enters the battlefield, you're going to mill 3 cards, and then it has an ability that's very similar to Syr Konrad's. Whenever a creature dies or a creature card is put into a graveyard from a library, each opponent loses 1 life. The trigger is very similar to Syr Konrad, except that it has to be from a library or from play. And since we are self-milling, we're going to see that happen quite often. And the 2 of them together are actually pretty deadly, because that's 2 damage per creature that goes into the graveyard from a mill. And that's excellent damage. And it's to each opponent, which is also excellent. Next up, we have Fleshbag Marauder. This is basically the same thing as the Disciple, except it doesn't see planeswalkers. This is 2 and a black for a 3/1. When it enters the battlefield, each player sacrifices a creature. And again, for 3, if you manage to catch 3 other creatures, including your own, that's 4 triggers. So you're paying 3 to get a 3/1 body and deal 4 damage. It's pretty cool to each opponent, for the record. So it's actually 12 damage. Next up, we have Golgari Thug, and this is one of the cheekier pieces in here. For 1 and a black, it's a 1/1. When Golgari Thug dies, you get to put target creature card from your graveyard on top of your library, and it has Dredge 4. So this is just an entire setup on a single card. The Dredge 4 says you skip your draw step, and instead of drawing, you're going to mill 4 cards and then return Golgari Thug from your graveyard to your hand. Okay. And then Golgari Thug puts a creature on top of your library, so you're guaranteed, once you use Golgari Thug, to set up your next mill to do at least 1 damage to each opponent. So it's basically a whole package in one. A super good card for this deck. Self-mill needs Dredge so badly, and this is such a perfect piece for it. Next up, we have Gravedigger for 3 and a black. This is 2/2. This is an OG card. This goes all the way back to Portal. When Gravedigger enters the battlefield, you may return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. So we're just getting some of that recursion. But again, with Syr Konrad on the field, when you remove that creature from the graveyard and put it back into your hand, Syr Konrad sees that as a trigger and deals 1 damage. So for 4, you're returning a creature. You're getting a body. You're returning a creature to your hand, and you're dealing 1 damage to each opponent for a total of 3. That's pretty good value, in my opinion. Next up, we have Gravelighter. This is 2 and a black for a 2/2 with flying, and it's the most unique of this kind of ability because it says, when Gravelighter enters the battlefield, you get to draw a card if a creature died this turn. Otherwise, each player sacrifices a creature. So it has the same effect as the Fleshbag, or it has another effect. So if you maybe need the card draw, then the Gravelighter is a great way to see that card draw if a creature has died, which is really easy with this deck, especially your creatures. But at the same time, if you really need the Fleshbag ability, then boom, you have it on this card. It does one or the other, and I think that's really interesting, just in as far as mechanics are concerned. Then we got Grey Merchant of Asphodel. I don't think any black deck is complete, mono black deck, I should say, is complete without one of these guys, but for 3 and 2 black, it's a 2/4 body, and when it enters the battlefield, each opponent loses X life, where X is your devotion to black, and you gain life equal to the life lost this way. This could be a game closer, basically. If there's enough aristocrat triggers from your aristocrat pieces, including Syr Konrad, by the time this hits the table, it could be deadly. Next up, we got Merciless Executioner. Another flesh bag effect here. For 2 and a black, you got a 3/1 body. When it enters the battlefield, each player sacrifices a creature. And again, it's just 2 and a black for a 3/1 body and 12 damage if Syr Konrad's on the table. All right, next up we have Milliken. For 2, you have a 0/1 body. You can tap it to mill a card and add 1 colorless. So it's a mana rock, it mills a card, and it's a body, I guess. I mean, the fact that it's a body is odd to me, but you get to mill a card and you get to add mana to your mana pool. So there's no downsides for this deck. Not always good for all decks, but really good for this deck. Next up, we got Mind Rack Harpy. For 3 and a black, it is a 3/2 body with flying. At the beginning of combat on your turn, each player puts the top 3 cards of their library into their graveyard. So this is one of very few pieces in here that are actually going to mill every opponent. And the reason it's in here is because we see 3 cards per attack on this, and since it has flying, it has really good evasion. So I don't see any downside to doing a little bit of mill on my opponents, because I'm sure they're going to have creatures as well. And Syr Konrad's own ability mills too, so it's not a big deal to have a little bit of non-self mill, but this also mills you too. So it's just a good card in general. Next up, we have Murderous Rider. For Swift End, it's 1 and 2 black to destroy target creature or planeswalker, and you lose 2 life. And then for 1 and 2 black, you get a 2/3 lifelink. When Murderous Rider is put on the bottom of its... Oh, sorry. When Murderous Rider dies, you get to put it on the bottom of its owner's library. It's just in here for the kill spot removal. There's a lot of ways to reoccur this from your graveyard if necessary. Its other ability to be put on the bottom of the library is kind of interesting because it'll hit the graveyard, then it'll leave the graveyard, which Syr Konrad will see both triggers, so that's 2 damage. That's pretty cool. Next up, we have Ornithopter of Paradise. This is 2 for a 0/2 flying that you can tap to add any 1 color. So just a flying mana rock. Next up, we have Palladiumer, 3 for a 2/2 that you can tap for 2 colorless. And in case you're wondering why there's this many mana rocks that are also creatures, we have Recursion. We need the creatures in general to go to the graveyard anyway. And also, Syr Konrad costs 5. On death, he's going to cost you 7. The next death, he's going to cost you 9. The next death, he's going to cost you 11. So being able to have the right amount of mana to recast him is insanely important in this deck. So having all these incidental mana rocks as well as extra non-creature mana rocks and land is really important. Next up, we have Persistent Specimen. For 1 black, this is a 1/1. You can pay 2 and a black to return Persistent Specimen from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. This is one of, I think, 3 different cards in here that do that roughly same effect. It's great for sack triggers. It's also great for Syr Konrad triggers because when it leaves the graveyard, Syr Konrad sees it. Next up, we have Plague Crafter, another flesh bag effect here. For 2 and a black, you have a 3/2. When it enters the battlefield, each player sacrifices a creature or planeswalker, and each player who can't discards a card. Worst case scenario, if they can't do it, you make them discard a card. If they discard a creature, Syr Konrad still sees that as a trigger. So it's a very cool little synergy piece there. Next up, we have Ravenous Chupacabra. For 2 and 2 black, it's a 2/2. When it enters the battlefield, destroy target creature an opponent controls. Spot removal effect, Syr Konrad will see it. Reassembling Skeleton. For 1 and a black, it's a 1/1. For 1 and a black, you can return Reassembling Skeleton from your graveyard to the battlefield. Again, just like the Persistent Specimen, we're trying to get as many maximized triggers as possible. Anything that goes into the graveyard from Syr Konrad's, from all the self-mill that you're going to be doing, not just Syr Konrad's self-mill, that can actually reoccur itself from the graveyard is actually really important for this deck. There's some things that you're not going to see in here, Nether Trader, Bloodghast, stuff like that. Some of those are just really expensive, and it would take this way out of budget. But also, I just like these triggers a little bit better because they're pretty cut and dry how it works. And then lastly of those groups, we have Well, actually, this isn't the last one, now that I think about it. It's the last skeleton, though. Sanitarium Skeleton. For 1 black, it's a 1/2. For 2 and a black, you can return Sanitarium Skeleton from your graveyard to your hand. And the fact that it costs 1 black is kind of nice, because being able to recast it from your hand is kind of the caveat there, and for 1 black, that's not that hard. Next up, we have Shriekmaw. This is 4 and a black for a 3/2 body. It has Fear. When Shriekmaw enters the battlefield, destroy target non-artifact, non-black creature, and it evokes for 1 and a black. I like this because if you have Syr Konrad on the battlefield, when you evoke Shriekmaw, it still does enter the battlefield for just the smallest amount of time, and then immediately goes to the graveyard, which Syr Konrad will see. Next up, we have Sivris, Nightmare Speaker, 3 and a black for a 3/3. You can tap Sivris to sacrifice another creature or an artifact. For each opponent, they are going to mill a card, then return that card from your grave. Then return, yeah, that's right, you mill a card. For each opponent, you mill a card, and then return that card from the graveyard to your hand unless an opponent pays 3 life. Unless that player pays 3 life. So essentially, we sack a creature, which is going to do a Syr Konrad trigger. Then we're going to self-mill a card. If it hits the graveyard and it's a creature, well, it's going to hit the graveyard. If it's a creature, it's going to see Syr Konrad trigger. Then your opponent has to either allow you to put it back in your hand or pay 3 life to keep it in the graveyard. If they do allow you to bring it back to your hand, that's a Syr Konrad trigger. So this sees a lot of Syr Konrad triggers, and that was just on 1 player. If it happens on all 3 players, it's a lot of damage being dealt. Obviously, paying 3 life to keep it in the graveyard is probably less damaging or more damaging than just allowing the Syr Konrad triggers, but I don't know how that math fully works out. Next up, we have Stinkweed Imp. This guy is another MVP for this deck. It is 2 and a black for a 1/2 with flying. When Stinkweed Imp deals combat damage to a creature, destroy that creature, death touch. And it dredges for 5. This one has the highest dredge cost in the deck, so we can see a lot of possible triggers for Syr Konrad here. And with all the sack triggers, there's no problem getting this into the graveyard. So Stinkweed Imp. Next up, we have Stitcher's Supplier. For 1 black, it's a 1/1. When it enters the battlefield or dies, you get to mill 3 cards. I don't have to explain why that's good. We got Street Wraith. For 3 and 2 black, it's a 3/4 body with Swamp Walk, and you can cycle it for 2 life. Mostly, you are probably just going to cycle this ASAP once you have Syr Konrad on the table, because, again, cycling this creature is a Syr Konrad trigger. But on top of that, with Recursion, you can get this back out. So if an opponent has swamps, this guy is kind of a deadly thing to have on the table. Next up, we have Tenacious Underdog. For 1 and a black, it's a 3/2 body with Blitz, which is 2 and 2 black and pay 2 life. You can cast Tenacious Underdog from your graveyard using its Blitz ability. Blitz basically says that it enters the battlefield with haste, and then it has an additional text that says you get to, or if this creature dies, you draw a card, and then it also has an additional text that says at the end of your turn, sacrifice this creature. Which, I mean, there's enough said there that we see 2 Konrad triggers just from that alone, but then you also get to draw a card, so that's excellent in this deck. And it's a recursion thing, again. Next up, we have Tormod the Desecrator. For 3 and a black, we have a 4/2 body. Whenever 1 or more cards leave your graveyard, create a tapped 2/2 black zombie creature token. Yeah, so we're only seeing if things leave the graveyard, but there's enough things that leave the graveyard and enough effects in this deck to force things to leave the graveyard that this is going to give you an army of tokens. If not, it's going to give you enough tokens to pay off some of those sack triggers that maybe you don't want to use your creatures for. Like, for instance, Fleshbag Marauder and all that. A 3/1 is still better than a 1/1. Next up, we have Undead Butler. For 1 and a black, it's a 1/2. When Undead Butler enters the battlefield, mill 3 cards. When Undead Butler dies, you may exile it. And when you do, return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. So it dying is a Syr Konrad trigger, it being exiled is a Syr Konrad trigger, and it returning the creature card from your graveyard to your hand is a Syr Konrad trigger. So just keep in mind that this is for 1 and a black, 3 damage as long as Syr Konrad is in play. Undead Gladiator. This guy is 1 and 2 black for a 3/1. It costs, or sorry, you can pay 1 and a black to discard a card and return Undead Gladiator from your graveyard to your hand. You can activate the ability only during your upkeep, and you can cycle it for 1 and a black. The cycling is really cool because we can just get it into the graveyard and then use its ability to bring it back. Its ability requires you to discard a card, and if you discard a creature card, Syr Konrad sees that. So there's a lot of synergy with that in Syr Konrad. Next up, we have Viconia Drow Apostate for 2 and a black. It's a 2/3 at the beginning of your upkeep. If there are 4 or more creature cards in your graveyard, return a creature card at random from your graveyard to your hand. Yeah, so again, this goes with the recursion. The more creatures that are in your graveyard, the more times you're going to return things from your graveyard to your hand. And again, because we only have 35 creatures in here and we're banking off of Syr Konrad triggers to win the game, being able to recur things over and over again back to your hand is really important. And because of all the discard strategies that are in here as well, you're going to need that just in general anyway. Next up, we have Viscera Seer. This is pretty simple. 1 black for a 1/1. You can sacrifice a creature to scry 1. It's a good sack outlet, which, again, Syr Konrad will see those triggers. We've got Whisper Blood Liturgist. This is 3 and a black for a 2/2. You can tap her and sacrifice 2 creatures to return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. The fact that it returns to the battlefield is just icing on the cake. That is 3 triggers alone for Syr Konrad, and you get something to the battlefield. It could be tokens that you're sacrificing. It doesn't really matter how it goes. It's still 3 triggers and an amazing value engine. And then finally, we got Zulaport Cutthroat. For 1 and a black, it's a 1/1. Whenever Zulaport Cutthroat or another creature you control dies, each opponent loses life and you gain a life. Again, like the Blood Artist, except this one hits each opponent, and you still gain life for that. It's really good for padding your life total, which you're probably going to need. Just saying. All right, next up is Instants. And again, because there are so many creatures, we are going to have very few in the way of other cards here, but we still managed to fit in quite some value in here. Starting with Corpse Churn for 1 and a black, you can put the top 3 cards of your library into your graveyard, then you may return a creature card from your graveyard to your hand. We're milling and returning a creature card, all synergy with Syr Konrad. We got Dark Ritual for 1 black, you add 3 black. It's just a mana positive ritual. It's very good. It's OG. We got Defile. If for 1 black, target creature gets -1/-1 for each swamp you control. It's a great spot removal piece, and it gets around indestructible, most importantly. We got Dig Up the Body. This is 2 and a black with Casualty 1. So you can, on cast, sacrifice a creature with power 1 or greater to copy this spell, which allows you to mill 2 cards and then return a creature card from your graveyard to your hand. So this could possibly be up to 7 triggers of Syr Konrad, which is really good for 3 mana. Next up, we have Foot Bottom Feast for 2 and a black, and this is one of 3 cards that does exactly the same thing. Foot Bottom Feast for 2 and a black, put any number of target creature cards from your graveyard on top of your library, and then draw a card. Each of those creatures that you put on top of your library is leaving the graveyard and is a trigger for Syr Konrad, so that is just incredibly annoying to begin with. But now you have put a whole bunch of creatures on top of your library, which guarantees if you self-mill, you're hitting nothing but creatures for X amount of time. That's amazing. Which brings us to Grave Purge, which does the exact same thing. Put any number of target creature cards from your graveyard on top of your library and draw a card. Then we have Overwhelming Remorse for 4 and a black. It costs 1 less to cast for each creature card in your graveyard, and you exile target creature or planeswalker. Again, it gets around indestructible. Next up, we have Tainted Strike. For obvious reasons. I know it seems disgusting, but the reality is that Syr Konrad will become a target when all of this comes together very, very quickly. So the fastest you can shut out the game, probably the best. For 1 black, target creature gets +1/+1 and gains Infect until end of turn. Now let me just read Syr Konrad. Yes, Syr Konrad says deals 1 damage. Infect would make that 1 poison counter to each opponent, and if you mill enough, you just kill them. And so this is just kind of this is supposed to be a win con. Next up, we have Village Rites. For 1 black, you sacrifice a creature, draw 2 cards. I don't have the one from All Will Be 1 in here, which I might consider putting in here, just because it's good value to have the repeat. But 1 black, as an additional cost, sacrifice a creature, draw 2 cards. In this deck, that's amazing. Well, actually, pretty much in any deck, that's amazing. Okay, next up is Sorceries. We're going to start with Atrocious Experiment. For 2 black, target player mills 2 cards and draws 2 cards and loses 2 life. Again, a nice way to draw cards. We're going to self-mill, so on and so forth. We got Dark Deal. For 2 black, each player discards all cards in his or her hand, then draws that many cards, -1. Yeah, you're going to have to discard a card. Yeah, it's a wheel -1. But the reality is any number of creatures that your opponents end up discarding is a Syr Konrad trigger, and that's pretty amazing. For 2 black, you're going to get possibly quite a bit of plus damage on that. That to me is worth it alone. Next up, we have Dread Return. For 2 black, return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. You can flash it back for sacrificing 3 creatures. There's a lot of Syr Konrad triggers there, obviously. Next up is Feed the Swarm. For 1 black. Destroy target artifact destroy target creature or enchantment an opponent controls, and then lose life equal to that permanent's converted mana cost or mana value. Again, this one is in here, and I have it in a lot of decks. It's in here because of versatility. Being able to get rid of enchantments is really important, especially for a deck that doesn't have any green in it. Enchantments are sticky. I've said this in many, many videos. They're very difficult to get rid of, mostly because people just don't run a lot in the way of enchantment destruction, though they should. Forever Young is the final of those 3 cards. For 1 black, it costs 1 less, but it is a sorcery speed. You can put any number of creatures, target creature cards from your graveyard on top of your library and draw a card. So we lose the instant speed, but we also lose 1 generic mana off of it. And again, it just sets it up like the other ones do. Then we have Living Death, which is hilarious because the way it's worded. So for 3 and 2 black, you get to set aside all cards in all graveyards. Sorry, all creature cards in all graveyards. So the actual text for that is you exile all creatures from all graveyards, which Syr Konrad will see. And because it does that part first, then it moves to the second part where then put each creature that's in play into its owner's graveyard, which is destroy all creatures in play. Syr Konrad will see all those creatures die, including, well, he won't see himself, obviously. So because they put the exile all creatures in all graveyards first, he's going to see all the triggers from the creatures exiting the graveyard. Then he's going to see all the triggers from all the creatures that are in play hitting the graveyard. And then you will get all the creatures that were exiled from your graveyard into play. And I just thought that was amazing as far as a board wipe is concerned. Yeah, your opponent gets a bunch of creatures back, but is it really going to be worth it? Because that is a huge amount of damage just being slung around potentially. I think this in a Syr Konrad deck is a staple must include always. But that's just my opinion on that. Next up, we have Summon Undead. For 4 and a black. You may mill 3 cards, then return a creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. The to the battlefield part is probably the most important part. That's probably why it costs 4 and a black. Otherwise, this card is absolutely terrible. Siphon Mind. For 3 and a black, each other player discards a card from his or her hand, and then you draw a card for each card discarded this way. The potential here is that if your opponents discard creature cards, Syr Konrad sees that. Otherwise, it doesn't really matter because you're going to replace, you're going to draw cards equal to the number of cards discarded that way. In a 4-player game, that means you're drawing 3 cards, and that's pretty good value. Next up, we have Unearth for 1 black. Return target creature card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield, and it cycles for 2. Most of the stuff in here is 3 or less. Unfortunately, that is going to miss some higher, or bigger pieces in here, like the Angel of Suffering and stuff like that, but it's fine. Finally, we have Victimize. For 2 and a black, choose 2 creature cards in your graveyard, sacrifice a creature. If you do, return those creature cards from your graveyard to the battlefield. I mean, it's 1, 2, 3 triggers for 3, and you get 2 creatures back, and all you have to do is sacrifice 1 creature. It's hard to deny that that's a really good card in here. All right, next up is Artifacts. Starting with the Arcane Signet. Cost 2, you can tap it to add 1, well, in this case, 1 black. We got Charcoal Diamond, also cost 2, enters the battlefield tapped, and you can tap it for black. We got Desecrated Tomb, cost 3, whenever 1 or more creature cards leave your graveyard, you get to create a 1/1 black bat creature token with flying. I like the fact that it has flying. If you're able to create a bunch of these, then you actually have a pretty decent evasive army. If not, you have good sack targets. Next up, we have Mindstone. It costs 2. You can tap it for colorless, and you can tap 1 and sack it. Tap 1 it and sack it to draw a card. We got Mind Crank, probably the most important piece in this deck, or at least one of the most important pieces in this deck. This costs 2, and whenever an opponent loses life, that player mills that many cards. So essentially, we're going to self-mill ourselves. We're going to catch X amount of creatures. Our opponents are each going to lose X life and mill X cards, and if they catch any creatures while milling those cards, they're going to lose X life and then mill X more cards and keep doing that until nobody mills any creatures, basically. And that can be a very long cycle and a lot of damage. It's a very important card in here. It's also a very big target. Next up is the new edition from Lord of the Rings, Palantir of Orthanc. Orthanc. Palantir of Orthanc. I'm probably butchering the crap out of that name, and I really just don't care. It is 3. At the beginning of your end step, put an influence counter on Palantir of Orthanc and scry 2. Then, target opponent may have you draw a card. If that player doesn't, you mill X cards, where X is the number of influence counters on Palantir of Orthanc, and that player loses life equal to the total mana value of those cards. There's a lot going on here, but to sum it up, if your opponents let you draw a card, then all you did was scry and draw a card and put a counter on this. If your opponents don't let you draw a card, you scried, you put a counter on here, and you milled X cards that could be creatures. So if they're creatures, Syr Konrad sees that. But on top of that, your opponents are going to lose life. Is it all opponents? No. The player you chose is going to lose life equal to the mana value of all the cards that get milled. So the more influence counters that are on Palantir, the more life they potentially lose, not just from Palantir alone, but from Syr Konrad. This card is insane in any deck that has Syr Konrad as the commander or just has Syr Konrad in the 99. But in general, this card is just insane by itself. This is just a really good by itself card. Next up, we have Perpetual Timepiece. For 2, you can tap it to put the top 2 cards of your library into your graveyard. And for 2, you can exile Perpetual Timepiece, shuffle any number of cards from your graveyard into your library. So this is a failsafe, and I think it's the only one that I've included in here. There used to be Elixir of Immortality in here as well. If you mill too much, if for whatever reason your opponents have just been so on top of it that they, after all of your self-milling and Syr Konrad triggers, or, they've just been on top of killing Syr Konrad, you are in a very sticky position. This allows you to get your graveyard back into your library and possibly live a little bit longer to try and shut out the game later. You shouldn't rely on that. If you get to that point, you're probably going to die. We'll just say that outright, which is why I removed the Elixir of Immortality. Next up, we have Soul Ring, costs 1. You can tap it for 2. And next up, and finally, I should say, we have Wayfarer's Bauble, costs 1. You can pay 2 and tap it to sacrifice it to search your library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield, tap, then shuffle. Nice little ramp spell for a color that doesn't generally get ramp. Next up, we have enchantments. There are only 3 enchantments, but they're all very important. We have Cemetery Tampering. For 2 and a black, it has Hideaway 5. At the beginning of your upkeep, you may mill 3 cards. Then, if there are 20 or more cards in your graveyard, you may play the exiled card without paying its mana cost. Otherwise, it's just going to continue to mill 3. Even after you've played the card that's underneath it, you're just going to continuously mill 3. I don't see any downside to that, except that eventually this is going to become a huge problem, and there isn't really much ways to sacrifice it. So, next up, we have Scion of Halaster. This is 1 and a black. Commander creatures you own have the first time you would draw a card each turn. Instead, look at the top 2 cards of your library, put one of them into your graveyard, and put the other back on top of your library, then draw a card. This is very similar to another card that I had, or the Surveil card, Doom Whisperer, in that we get to look at these cards and then decide if we want to put cards into our graveyard. In this case, you have to put at least 1 in your graveyard. But as long as you're continuously putting creatures in your graveyard, you're getting the triggers. And then finally, we have Tortured Existence, another staple for a deck like this. For 1 black, it's an enchantment. You can pay a black and choose and discard a creature card specifically to return a creature from your graveyard to your hand. And this one is not conditional on mana value, so we can catch just about any creature in our graveyard. And it, again, triggers lots of Syr Konrad triggers, so amazing. And you don't have to tap it to use it. So if you have a lot of black mana open and you just want to find as many Syr Konrad triggers as possible, well, there you go. Every black mana you spend, you get to do 2 damage with Syr Konrad. Next up is going to be non-basic lands. We got ourselves a Bojuka Bog. I've said this more than once, but if you're running any black mana at all, you're probably running a Bojuka Bog. It's just really good. Enters the battlefield tapped. When it enters the battlefield, exile all cards from target player's graveyard, and then add black mana to your mana pool. If your opponents have a really high density of creatures, that's a whole bunch of creatures leaving the graveyard. And that's a whole bunch of Syr Konrad triggers. You could do it to yourself, even. I mean, if you have a high density of creatures in your graveyard, that's a great way to maybe kill everyone. It could be a game ender. I mean, how many times have you heard Bojuka Bog being a game ender? Anyway, Bojuka Bog. Next up, we have Cabal Coffers. You can tap 2 and this, and add a black mana to your mana pool for each swamp you control. So basically, you pay 3, and hopefully you go mana positive. This gets really ridiculous over time. The more swamps you have, the more mana this just outright creates. Next up, we have Dakmor Salvage. Enters the battlefield tapped. You can tap it for black mana, and it has Dredge 2. So if it ends up getting self-milled, and you end up not having a land drop, well, look at that. You have Dakmor Salvage. You could just dredge it and put it into your hand and play a land for the turn. And Dredge, again, super important for this deck. Next up, we have Mortuary Mire. Enters the battlefield tapped. When it enters the battlefield, you may put target creature card from your graveyard on top of your library, and you can tap it for black. We get that nice little Syr Konrad trigger there. We got Myriad Landscape. Enters the battlefield tapped. You can tap it for colorless, or you can tap 2 and it and sacrifice it to search your library for 2 basic land cards that share a land type. Great for monocolored decks. Also pretty good for decks that have 2 colors in them. Any more than that, and it's kind of not that great. We got Takacia's Dig Site. Not the last one. Takacia's Dig Site can tap for colorless, and you can pay 3 and tap it to Surveil for 1. Surveil triggers in here aren't like always better than just self-mill, but it actually is pretty good at sussing out things that may not be creatures. So self-mill, you're just going to outright get rid of the things, whether they're creatures or not. With Surveil, you have an opportunity to see, okay, is this a creature? Okay, then I'll discard it. So I like Surveil in this for that reason, just because you get a little bit of control. And then finally, we have Witch's Cottage. You can tap. It counts as a swamp. Taps for black. When it enters the battlefield, it enters tapped unless you control 3 or more other swamps. And when it enters the battlefield untapped, you may put target creature card from your graveyard on top of your library. And that will conclude the non-basics. Finally, we have the basic lands, all the swamps. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26 swamps. Okay, so that is Syr Konrad. That is a self-mill deck. The reason I wanted to go with self-mill, first off, is I just didn't want to build the group mill deck. Partially because, A, I wanted to build on a budget. Most of this was in my collection already. And B, everybody is building the group mill version. If you go on edhrec right now, there is a fraction of the number of decks that are group mill versus self mill. Self mill just has so few. I think it was 30, maybe it was 50. It was in the double digits, whereas I think group mill was either in the triple or quadruple digits. I think that's a shame because the benefit of the Syr Konrad self mill is that it's standalone. You do not have to worry about what your players bring to the table. So if your players are playing Voltron, which traditionally has a very low creature count, you're not down and out because you're self-contained, right? You already have the creatures in here. You already have lots of recursion strategies in here. The amount of synergy that this deck has is ridiculous. The one downside, obviously, being that Syr Konrad costs 5. Right. So I found that this deck was a lot more fun to play. There are a couple other styles that you could, well, actually, there's about a dozen other styles that you could play Syr Konrad as. This was the one that I felt was more important to me. So that is Syr Konrad self-mill. Yeah, that's about it. If you have any questions or comments, leave those down below. Otherwise, let's keep it positive. There's no room for negativity here. And that's it, guys. Peace.